Good morning, everyone. We're just giving folks a couple minutes here to join and then we'll get started. If you're just joining us, we're just giving folks a couple seconds to join here, and we will kick off our content in just a minute or so. Looks like that has slowed down, so we'll go ahead and get kicked off with our introductory remarks and let people continue to join as they can. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on developing a comprehensive wildfire risk reduction plan. I'm Melissa Keene. I'm the Director of Enterprise Programs and Special Projects for the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your host and moderator for this morning's conversation. Here's a quick overview of our agenda for today. Right now we're just doing a welcome and introductions, and then we're going to hear presentations from James Gillespie. I will completely mangle your last name now. Apologies in advance. Gillespie, who's a fire marshal in Newport Beach, and Dave Winnacker, who is a retired fire chief for Moraga-Orinda Fire District and is a consultant with our partner, Renne Public Management Group. And then we were going to dive into a discussion and audience Q&A, and then we will wrap up and adjourn by 12:30. Couple of quick housekeeping items before we jump in. As you probably noticed when you joined today's webinar, you are muted and you will be muted for the duration of today's event. But that doesn't mean that you cannot chat with us. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can drop questions into that Q&A box at any point during today's conversation. We'll be monitoring that and responding to anything that's logistical, anything you need real time, and then anything that's related to the content we'll be pulling in to a queue for that discussion and Q&A that I mentioned just a second ago. We also are recording today's session, and that recording will be shared along with the materials and slide deck from today's webinar shortly thereafter. I want to share a little bit of information about my organization, the Institute for Local Government, before we dive into the content, in case you aren't super familiar with us. So we are a statewide nonprofit that's affiliated with the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. So we work with our affiliates to serve over 2,500 local agencies comprised of cities, counties, and special districts. And we provide practical and easy to use resources so that you all as local agencies can more effectively implement policies on the ground. We do this in a number of ways. We provide a lot of education and training, like this webinar. We also do longer format training, conference sessions, etc. We also provide technical assistance, capacity building, and convening services to local agencies, as well as a host of written resources that are accessible online. And we focus in four main areas. We do a lot of work around leadership and governance, so helping agencies operate more effectively and efficiently and work together with their governing teams and staff and community. We have a program focused on workforce development and civics education, so helping agencies work through recruitment and retention challenges, create a pipeline into public service. And right now we're exploring public sector apprenticeship programs in areas outside of the building trades and public safety, and what that can really look like for local governments. We have a program focused on public engagement, so helping you all as public agencies be more strategic and proactive with your public engagement efforts. And then lastly, sustainable and resilient communities, which is where this conversation will mainly fit into. So we do a lot around climate resilience, land use, housing, those types of things to help you all navigate some of those really complex challenges on the ground. So all to say, if you're not super familiar with us, please check out our website, join our newsletter list so you can hear about upcoming trainings and new resources as they're developed. So this is the second webinar in the series of 4 that we're going to be working through. You see the 2 following dates there on the screen right now. Our next webinar will be in mid-November, and we'll close out the series in January with everybody's favorite topic on CEQA. So registration for all of these is open now. So click that link and we can drop that in the chat for you as well. But we hope that you will go back and take a look at our first webinar if you did not join us last month, and then join us for the following two conversations that we'll be having later this year and early into next. So as I mentioned, I'm joined by James and Dave, who are going to lead our conversation over the next hour or so. And I will let them introduce themselves in a little bit more depth. But before we go there, I want to let our partner at Renne Public Law Group, John Holtzman, set the stage for today's conversation. This is his brainchild to do this webinar series on such an important topic. So John, take it away.
Thanks, Melissa. First of all, I just want to quickly reintroduce Dave for those who weren't on last time and introduce James. Dave was a firefighter in a variety of places, Fresno, Alameda, etc., for a while, and then he served for 7 years as the chief of the Moraga-Orinda Fire District. He served as Western Fire Chiefs Association's California Director and California Fire Chiefs Association's WUI, Wildland Urban Interface Task Force Lead, among other things. At Stanford University, he is a Hoover Institution Veteran Fellow, where he works on the intersection of wildfire and property insurance with an emphasis on pricing risk. In the private sector, he co-founded Zonehaven, which is many of you use for evacuation software, and has more recently co-founded Xyloplan, which is a wildfire risk assessment and visualization company. You will see some examples of the kind of visualization we're talking about in this session. Prior to joining the fire service, he served in a variety of roles in the Marine Corps, and then ultimately Marine Corps Reserve, and is currently a general in the Marine Corps Reserve. James is the fire marshal of Newport Beach, and he also has numerous sort of academic credentials, et cetera, that go along with all of that, and is a real expert in this field. Very, somebody we all look to for advice on how this stuff works in the real world. So today we're in for a real treat. Today is we're going to be looking at an actual wildfire risk reduction plan for Newport Beach. So, and I think I just want to add one general thought as kind of a meta thought about what's going on in this field. When we as city officials, county officials, whatever, public officials, when the public encounters a crisis, whether it be homelessness or voting or crime, etc., there's often a political will to do something. There's often too funding available, probably a little less so in the current environment that there was when the federal government was more active in the funding world. But often the science and the sort of the rationality can lag that will. And the challenge with that is that we often then spend a lot of money and a lot of time pursuing solutions that may or may not have some political viability, and absorb decent amount of money, but may or may not be the right solutions or focused solutions. And the loss when that happens, of course, isn't just the financial loss. It's that precious time when there's a public will and focus on an issue is lost by pursuing solutions that may scratch the political itch a little bit, but don't actually, fix the problem. Or again, there's many of these problems are not fixable in kind of the grand scheme of things, but they're not really the right solution. So I think, when you watch James and Dave, I think the question, to be thinking about here is, because this is very focused on what is effective and what will work. and it's based on evidence. Thinking about how we can learn from this so that we can seize the moment that we currently have with the willpower that the public has to do the right thing. So again, very excited to introduce Dave and James.
Thank
All
you
right.
so
Thank you,
much,
John.
John. Yes.
Melissa.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share and let you pick it up, Dave.
All right, outstanding. Thank you, John and Melissa, for the introduction. Very excited to be able to share a real world example of what a mitigation plan looks like and what the steps are that one goes through to build one. As John alluded to, there are a lot of problems in the wildfire space, but money is not the only one of them. And having money doesn't solve the problem. This is not a problem where activity alone will bend the curve, and that there is not only a finite number of resources with regard to money, there's a finite amount of community will to act. And it is critically important that we have a plan, and that plan is aligned to the circumstances of the particular community. And that plan is also aligned to the resources available. A plan that is not realistically executable is not a particularly useful plan. So we're going to walk through what that looks like in a series of slides. So as we get started here, I will also point out that we're going to quickly review the methodology we talked about last month. So this will be very brief for those who have more questions about it or were not there. I'd recommend taking a look at last month's full presentation. So in short, a wildland fire and an urban fire are related but two fundamentally different things with regard to the mechanics of heat transfer. So to achieve the conditions necessary for sustained urban fire, as outlined by Jack Cohn in his WUI disaster sequence and the WUI fire problem in 2008, we have to have sustained strong winds. We have to have highly receptive vegetative fuels that are capable of carrying fast-moving fire. Given an ignition, we then can see rapid fire spread through ignition. And when that fire spread running through the vegetation encounters structures with vulnerabilities such that they are capable of being ignited by those vegetative fuels, and we see that occurring at a scale in both time and space that exceeds the available firefighting response, we can see firefighters become ineffective, in Jack Cohn's words. Simply put, there is more fire than firefighters at the critical points. And then if there are extents of tightly spaced structures downwind of the ignition point, we can see sustained urban fire spread. So given those preconditions, an ignition that causes a wildfire, and then the vulnerabilities that allow the initiation of a wildfire-initiated urban fire, we can see large-scale urban fire loss. And I would note that while wildfire is inevitable, and in fact is a beneficial feature in most parts of the fire-dependent landscape of the American West, so fire is inevitable, wildfire. However, the associated urban fire is not inevitable. And if we are able to address the vulnerabilities at the points of transition, we can very much bend the curve on the potential for large-scale urban fire loss. Here is just a graphic representation of vegetative fire encountering a point of transition, and then the subsequent urban fire that allows large-scale structure loss. And I would note then, with regard to vegetative fire, we're looking specifically at not only ground fire, which we see here represented by the small flames, but also by three-dimensional ember cast represented by the spotted lines. And so the mechanics of heat transfer that allow fire to move from vegetation to structures include not only encroachment of ground fire, but the initiation of downwind fires from three-dimensional ember casts that encounter either receptive fuel beds adjacent to structures or vulnerabilities allowing them to penetrate the structure. So as we see homes ignited, those homes now become the fuel likely to carry the fire, spreading not only additional ember, structure-produced embers, but also structure-to-structure fire spread. So we have not only three-dimensional ember cast, but we have direct heat transfer from vegetation to structures, from structures to structures, and from structures to vegetation to structures. So all of those mechanisms come into play to allow fire to rapidly spread through the community, meaning for the so what here is that a single wildfire mitigation approach, such as a fuel break, is only going to be effective against one of these mechanisms, in this case, ground fire, meaning the other mechanisms will remain unmitigated. And of note, the large-scale urban fires that we're talking about, only 4 of those fires have accounted for 50% of our structure loss. So to be clear, This is not all of the structures that are lost. It's just half of them from 4 fires, meaning these are the specific situations and features that allow an urban fire to be initiated, which are different than a wildland fire and isolated rural structures, or account for 50% of our structures, meaning there's a very specific approach we can take that can address at least half of the structure loss. To be clear, if you are representing a remote rural place, there's a different approach. PRC 4291 has since 1967 outlined the defensible space requirements, and Chapter 7A of the Building Code has shown what needs to be done for every structure that is exposed to risk. But in the urban setting, the heat transfer from a burning structure is so much greater than the heat produced by burning vegetation that we need a slightly different approach, because just a blanket everybody follow wildland specific mitigations is not likely to be effective, and certainly hasn't proven to be recently. And lastly, with regard to how fire comes to the community, we're looking at these through fire pathways. And those are the combination of topography, weather, and fuel that, when they are in alignment, can allow fire to proceed in the fastest route. So we're looking at the most efficient route of fire travel. And we're looking at the output here from not an intensity perspective. It doesn't necessarily matter how hot the fire is burning. Plenty of low intensity ground fires have burned homes. We're looking at the speed with which fire travels, so we can understand how quickly fire will enter the community and what are the points of entry where that fast moving fire will first reach the built environment. That was a very brief summary of what we covered in almost 90 minutes last month. So I'll then hand it over to James to give us an introduction to the city of Newport Beach and the specific risk factors and mitigations they're dealing with in that environment. James?
Thank you, Dave. So Newport Beach, often people think of us just as a beach community, but we do have quite a bit of wildland that we interact with, that we're responsible for, and quite a bit of structures and the built environment existing within that wildland area, where we can have a wildfire interacting with the urban environment. So roughly for land, we're about 23.8 miles with 86,000 residents. We do have 150 full-time firefighters, but at any given time on a scene, like Dave talked about, our response is still relatively limited for the amount of personnel we can get to a scene versus outrunning the fire. We do have stations located within distance of our wildfire area to respond with the appropriate apparatus, but again, limited in that we have one type 3. We have our engines that can go, but still very limited. And then we have older communities and we have newer communities. So we're faced on either side of the canyons. And if you could see on this image, if you look at San Joaquin Hills Road, on either side of that canyon, which we call Buck Gully, the built environment is completely different. We have homes from the 60s and 70s on kind of the north side of the canyon, and on the south side we have newer construction from about 2000 to 2005. But these homes are built completely different with completely different standards. So the way we approach it has to be different based off of the combustibility of the structure and the interface they have. So Dave, if you want to go to the next slide, we can kind of talk about those differences. So for Newport Coast, the area that we talked about that's newer, it was annexed into Newport Beach around 2002. It was actually built by Orange County Fire Authority. So they built it out for us and we annexed it into the city of Newport Beach. Part of their planning requirements to build those communities were to have them built with fuel modification zones. So the graphic on the right-hand side of the image shows what those fuel modification zones look like. Ultimately, they equal about 170 feet in space. The A zone being the most restrictive, with 20 feet inside the parcel line, the B zone being a little less restrictive, C zone a little bit less, and D zone a little bit less as you go further away from the structure. Most of those HOAs were built with these fuel modification zones in place. So we have the fuel treatment. Those structures were not built with what we see for modern homes built in those areas, such as Chapter 7A with ember-resistant vents, the 5-foot zone 0 potentially. Some may not have dual pane windows, many of them do. But a lot of the features that we'd inherently see to protect the structure from that 3D ember casting that Dave was talking about, it doesn't exist. Some of them do, some of them don't, but it doesn't exist across the board. So we have those fuel modification zones in place. The city, as part of the annexation agreement, actually reimburses the HOAs to do that work twice a year. So twice a year, I have a deputy fire marshal that goes and inspects all those properties, make sure that they meet our standard for the fuel modification zone. And then upon that, we reimburse them for the work performed for each individual HOA. versus the older community, they weren't built with that because at the time it wasn't required, it wasn't seen as a best practice, it wasn't necessary for the older community. So we have this in place, but it's one piece of the puzzle. We have the fuel modification zone, but we don't have the home hardening. We don't have the neighbor to neighbor issue. We do have density there. We do have large structures. And like Dave said, it's not necessarily a money thing. It is the community buying in to actually do stuff to their structure thing, really, because we have community members that have the financial means to take these changes. The problem is the education, the outreach, the enforcement potentially to get them there is what's going to move the needle, but one without the other doesn't move the needle. You can go to the next slide, Dave. So we talked about the fuel mod zones and went through that, but again, the construction features are important because it's a Class A roof, which is what you typically see in a home that was built in the wildland as of 2008-ish. The Class A roofs would be in non-combustible exterior, dual pane windows, but they don't have the ember protective vents that you would see on structures at this point in time. They oftentimes have a lot of vegetation. They have combustible fences. But this image is a fuel mod zone that we go and inspect and maintain. And you can see the clearing that's been done there, the spacing between the shrubs to allow that wildfire to travel to it, but to slow the speed of that wildfire and how it travels. And many of those zones are irrigated as well. So even those plant beds, the acacia, the ice plant, whatever it may be, they're irrigated and they are healthy plants trying to help solve that wildfire issue. You can see it on there. If you go to the next slide. You can see on the map again the two different communities and where they face. The community that we see at the bottom of the lower image, that's our older community built in the 60s and 70s. There's no defensible space. There's no fuel modification. Oftentimes the wildland runs right up to the property line of the structure and it's protected habitat. So for us to retroactively do fuel modification zones requires a lot, especially with working with folks that are land managers in open space. We've had to form a lot of partnerships, do a lot of outreach, a lot of collaborative work. We actually have a grant for roughly $450,000 to go through and create a 100-foot defensible space buffer in this area. It's going to run from the bottom of the gully up to the top. So we have a grant for that work, but these homes are also shake shingle siding, shake shingle roofs, combustible exteriors, potentially single pane windows, densely built where your property lines can maybe be 4 or 5 feet between some of the structures. Lots of vegetation, ornamental vegetation that's existed for a very long time in between the structures. So we find ourselves having to have one conversation with one side of the community that's almost, they're almost there. They're at about 3rd and 1, right? And then the other side of the community, we have to work the opposite direction where we have to pull them a long way. And so the education changes and also the ramifications of my department, what we do in our decisions have to be focused on 2 different contexts and 2 different conversations with the different communities.
All right. So as James alluded to, each community is different, and within his community, there are very different circumstances. And I would note that in those legacy parts of the community on the north side of Buck Gully, if fire gets into those homes, so 1960s housing stock, single pane windows, combustible siding and roofs in many cases, lots of vegetation, narrow streets, minimal setbacks, etc. If fire gets into those homes with wind on it, that fire is going to run structure to structure. And to be clear, the heat generated by a burning structure with that sort of density is going to ignite the adjacent structure, irregardless of the presence or absence of wildfire mitigations. And when you get to the 5, 10, 15 homes ignited in short period, you very quickly begin to outpace the firefighting response. And this is what happened in the Palisades. It happened in Altadena. It happened in the North Bay in 2017. To a lesser degree, that same phenomenon applies to Paradise in 2018, where we now have an urban fire. So the whole game in that sort of setting, where you cannot change the nature of all of the structures and you can't change the structure separation density, how the density of those structures. The whole game is to keep fire out of the homes. And that means understanding the points of entry and where fire has the ability to transition from being a vegetation fire to a structure fire. As I said, vegetation fire is inevitable. Nothing to be done about that. The structure fire can be modified or can be mitigated. So what we're going to talk through now is the mechanism for producing a site-specific assessment, and then how that translates in the 3rd or 4th part here, how that will then translate into building a prioritized mitigation program for that area. So the first thing we have to do is we have to quantify the risk. And Jennifer Bulk and the team she works with at the University of Colorado completed a study 2 years ago that found that 78% of the structures lost to wildfire in the American West occurred during the initial operating periods of fast-moving wind-driven fires. So the fire we are worried about is a wind-driven fire. Historically, a Santa Ana for Southern California, a Dabla wind event for Northern California, Bay Area, a Chinook or a Fern wind for other areas where we get strong sustained winds moving from generally from east to west or north-northeast to west, and very dry inland desert air moving out to the sea. We also can see some reversals though, where they come the other way. And so in this case, if you look at the weather rows at the top right, we looked at 3,240 days of the historical weather record from that area, specifically pulling the Elisa Laguna remote automated weather station data. We looked for those periods where live fuels, vegetative fuel, were cured, as in dried out or desiccated, to the point that they were capable of carrying fire. That point from Jack Cohn's sequence about given sustained winds and cured fuels, we could have extreme fire conditions. So having down selected for that 33% of the record where the live fuels were cured. So as an example, if we have a wind event in March in the middle of the rainy season when the vegetation is in green up, nobody cares because the vegetation won't carry fire. But if we have that same wind event when the fuels are cured and it's occurring during a sustained dry period, so we have had low relative humidity for a period of time, and we then have a sustained high wind event where we see low relative humidity and high wind speeds for sustained periods of time. To that point, had the LA fires in January, had those ignitions occurred inside a 1 hour wind event, the extent of the damage would have been far more limited because when the wind stops, the fire's progression generally stops. But when you have sustained dry winds, when fuels are cured, then we have the potential for extreme fire weather. And in the Newport Beach and really southern Orange County area, the wind rows on the right shows what that looks like, where we have fire weather winds coming from the north-northeast to east, as well as from the west. So we're looking at two specific scenarios: wind coming from the north-northeast, wind coming from the west, right? Those working at almost 180 degrees out on the compass rose, those winds will be, and those fires will behave very differently. We also looked at the duration of those winds to determine how long the fire should be allowed to spread. Next, we looked at fire history to see what matches up. Here you see for Laguna Beach, and here's Buck Gully we were talking about, and here's the Crystal Cove development area. Here is the fire history in that area with a couple of specific highlights, specifically the Laguna fire in 1993, as well as the coastal fire in May of 2022. Laguna fire moving from east to west, coastal fire moving from west to east. Of note, as you can see in the picture in the coastal fire, those homes burned despite the presence of a fuel modification zone that you can see in the bottom left of that picture where the green ice plant and other irrigated FMZs held. That did not burn. Fire stopped. On the other hand, three-dimensional Embercast carried firebrands over the FMZ, and those homes still burned, irregardless of the fact that an FMZ was in place. FMZ decoupled the homes from the ground component fire, but did not protect them from Embercast. So next we look at what is a scenario where we see an ignition on a north-northeast wind event, so ignition running along any of the major roads there to the east, and where is that fire pathway from the orange ignition line moving from northeast to south or to southwest? How is fire going to spread, and where is fire going to enter the community? Of note, the fire spread modeled here largely matched what the Laguna fire did in 1993 to give a good validation that the model matched actual conditions. Here's an example of what an interior ignition under those northeast wind scenario, what that looks like, and how that fire from those ignition points with those spread lines, how it's going to be modeled to impact Los Troncos Canyon and Crystal Cove. So we can understand then where are the points of entry, where are the places that topography, weather, and fuel come into alignment, in this case primarily topography, to drive that fire into the community, and what are those points of entry? And then from those points of entry, what are the downstream potential for fire spread through structure to structure, subsequent structure to structure ignitions, so that pathways can be given weight and they can be prioritized based on the consequences of that particular fire pathway entering the community. And here's an example from an ignition line in the same area looking at a west wind. So before we saw a fire was going to move from northeast to southwest, and now we see if it's going to move from west to east on that opposite wind event. And I'll note that the ignition line is very similar. The outcome's fundamentally different. So the wind in this case really makes the threat, and understanding the wind conditions that are likely to carry the fire in a particular area is a critical component. You'll note on the weather rows, we just don't see a south to north fire weather scenario. And we see almost no north to south fire weather scenarios, right? Those in California and particularly the Mediterranean counties of California, that sort of weather pattern is primarily associated with a frontal passage that is bringing rain and measurable precipitation. So it's a very useful tool to be able to quantify the weather conditions that will create fire spread and then further understand, model the fire spread so that your mitigations and your risk reduction program can be matched to the local conditions. Because at least in my experience as fire chief, residents regularly would explain what they believed represented a significant risk to the community based on weather conditions that simply did not exist in our area. And the concern then becomes that the squeakiest wheel or the loudest voice is getting all the attention, and mitigation resources can flow to something that feels like it is risk reduction to a resident's particular perspective, but is not aligned with the actual conditions on the ground in that area. So as I said, a couple examples of what a west to east and a northeast to southwest scenario looks like, and then understanding what are the related points of entry, where fire is likely to enter into the community, so that we can then approach a multi-layered mitigation strategy to match local conditions. So option one is to carry out additional mitigations on the landscape so that these fire pathways are interrupted, so that fire's ability to travel along its preferred route of travel is disrupted by the presence of mitigations. As James alluded to, in southern coastal scrub, there have been many, some recently resolved not in favor of the state, lawsuits asserting that the use of either masticators, prescribed fire, or other mitigation strategies in southern coastal scrub is type conversion, which is not exempt under CEQA, and that the state has lost in court, and therefore the ability to carry out mitigation work in that particular fuel type is severely constrained and comes with significant environmental restrictions and monitoring requirements. And there's an argument to be made that in southern coastal scrub, carrying out mitigations to reduce the scrub is going to result in the growth of annual grasses that will actually carry fire faster through that area. So in their particular area, there are very real constraints on the work that can be done to interrupt the pathways in the natural environment. So if we take that domain off the table, we then move downstream in the progression to the second domain, which is either defensible space or extended defensible space combined with a fuel modification zone to decouple those homes at the points of entry from the ground component of fire, which is great. And with the FMZs, the City of Newport Beach and the Orange County Fire Authority before them had excellent foresight and were very progressive in requiring these FMZs around the community 25 years ago when the area was permitted. And that those FMCs are highly effective, if properly maintained, at keeping ground component of fire out of the community. So outstanding, great work, and a tip of the hat to those the people who had the foresight to require that a long time ago. But as we saw in the coastal fire just down the road from here, there are limitations to what the FMZs can achieve. And so while they're good, they should certainly not be abandoned. They're only addressing the ground component of fire, and that where these pathways enter the community in ember producing fuels such as southern coastal scrub, it is very likely that there will be three-dimensional ember cast as well. So understanding, once we have run the modeling, we can then start to reverse engineer what the mitigations would look like that could appropriately interrupt fire pathways and the points of entry that those pathways form into the community. So now we get into what that actually looks like. How do you take that the understanding of the weather and the known of the fuel type and condition and the topography, and how do we bring all of that together into a nuanced and ultimately appropriately resourced mitigation approach? And before we dive in, I'd just like to anchor here for a moment, which is, and I say this with great respect for all the folks who are working hard to reduce wildfire risk either throughout the state or throughout the West. And that is the critical need to move the conversation beyond we spent what we were allocated, and that our measure of performance is that the resources that were made available, either through grants, internal budget allocations, HOA investments, or the actions of private landowners, that we need to view this as relative, not absolute. And so we need to view it relative to the measures of effectiveness or the outcome. So rather than tracking performance, as in we spent this much money or we treated this many acres, we instead need to look at the outcome to see what that has achieved. And then we can thoughtfully build out our resource, either our grant proposals or our internal resource requests, or what we are asking our HOAs and our residents to carry out. We can thoughtfully build out our resource requests, and ultimately, for those who are in the policymaker realm, our resource allocations to match the needs. Because wildfire simply doesn't care about your effort, it cares about the outcome. And this is a case where there are no participation trophies. We have either done enough to mitigate the points of transition such that there will be the relative speed of the fire and the associated transition is slowed below the speed of the response, so that we will have more firefighters than fire at the points of transition to pick up the residual risk, or we have not. And that is knowable in advance. And too often in the wildfire space, we're primarily tracking activity. And we're saying, these are the things we have done, which is interesting. But the next step in the conversation should be, and those things we have done that we just faithfully listed have achieved the following with regard to delays in the arrival time, delays in the transition time, and steps, particularly with regard to new construction, with steps to compartmentalize the community so that fire is unable to rapidly run through the built environment. So with that, what that looks like. So here we look at that northeast scenario. The red line running along Highway 73 shows modeled roadside ignitions. The yellow lines show subsequent wildfire spread under that northeast wind scenario. And the purple line shows the existing FMZs. And then orange shows where a modeled fire pathway encounters a community. And what we see right away is that the FMZs are well positioned to pick up most of the fire pathways. So really, once again, a tip of the hat and really a hearty well done to those who designed that. And the FMZs, where they are present, are highly effective at decoupling ground fire. And so what this modeling then suggests is there are some opportunities for additional defensible space work to close the gap to where some of the FMZs do not completely close off some of the fire pathways that can be carried out by HOAs or residents on their private property to build that same resistance. Whether the FMZ is 170 feet from the house or whether the resident is carrying out defensible space on the 20 to 100 feet of private property that they control, the effect is the same. We have decoupled the ground component of fire from the house. The second part that comes about, particularly in those areas where we see entry points at FMZs, is, as addressed before, the fuel management zone decouples the ground component fire risk, but it doesn't address the three-dimensional ember cast as firebrands are carried aloft and forward by the fire winds. And so in those are areas where home hardening, which is we cannot require unless there's a permit event. If a resident is not rebuilding their house, we can't require them to retroactively install the home hardening adjuncts, but we can encourage it and we can incentivize it. And we can go to the places that matter and we can have the hard conversation about the need to replace their vents. And in the few cases where we have wood shake roof left, to replace the roof with a Class A covering or assembly. So that at these points of entry, the FMZs can be augmented or reinforced by the defensible space and home hardening that will make those homes also resistant to embers. And I note, though, that it's not everywhere. There are significant portions of the community that, because they are now interior, right, the surrounding homes are acting as a buffer or a shielding to protect the target, the structure, from the source, the wildland. And if we can keep fire out of those homes, the risk, the liability can become a protective feature, right? So we can change the narrative that the homes represent the risk, and the homes, if those homes that through which fire would have to travel to threaten the downstream homes, if those homes can be hardened and defensible space put in place in conjunction with the FMZs, they now form a non-burnable buffer that protects the downstream homes. And so what we see here then in the existing areas where we have we have those FMZs and we have good clearance around the community. We see a recommendation to do some work to get those homeowners at the points of transition to carry out defensible space and home hardening in accordance with either the locally adopted ordinance, or better yet, in accordance with the California Department of Insurance Safer from Wildfire framework, or the largely mirrored standard included in the IBHS wildfire prepared home. Both of which then start to address not only the mitigations that the science and the research and the testing support, but also align with those standards that are enshrined now by regulation by the California Department of Insurance for discounts. So we start to align our risk reduction activity with the manner in which the risk transfer industry is viewing the problem. And so so having looked at the newer developments with the FMZs, we next look at Buck Gully, where those legacy homes are without the FMZs and more exposure. And so from a wildland ignition in Buck Gully, we see this is the modeled impact of structure to structure fire spread. And as I mentioned a minute ago, we see very, very quickly that if structures begin to burn, the density is such and the vulnerabilities are so great that it is likely that you will very quickly see a runaway urban fire. And that if this fire gets established, there's going to be precious little not only the local agency is going to be able to do, but the regional mutual aid response. There's going to be precious little those firefighting resources are going to be able to do to stop the spread of the fire until wind stops. And we now move into the potential for loss of property, loss of life, and all of the sort of things that we have seen with historical urban fires, because that fire was able to get established. So having modeled the potential for ignitions in this place and coming up with the recommendations for defensible space and home hardening, on the right being done in concert with the existing FMZs, and on the left being done in the absence of FMZs, and really in the absence of the environmental environment that would allow large-scale FMZs to be produced, these become those priority parcels that are identified not only for their exposure to wildfire risk, because they have exposure to wildfire risk, but moreover to their exposure to wildfire risk and their potential to initiate urban fire. These are the areas that if homes in these areas begin to burn, the conditions are such that fire could rapidly transition into the built environment and then be transmitted from structure to structure. And we'd note, I think really importantly, that the homes on the northwestern side of Buck Gully are fundamentally different than the homes on the southwestern side, where the presence of the golf courses break up their exposure to wildland fuels and form really what is the mother of all FMZs, right? An FMZ established for the purpose of wildfire risk reduction is great, and it has to be maintained. And as James alluded to, he sends an inspector out twice a year to ensure the work's being done. Those fairways will not burn ever, and they are maintained as a matter of course because they are dual use. Because they have a recreational or a commercial purpose, we get the wildfire risk reduction benefits at no additional cost and requires no inspection, because fairways are maintained because that's what they're used for. And there's a myriad of other examples, such as dog parks, sports fields, commercial districts with parking lots, etc., that can do the same thing, where we see that while these homes look sort of blindly, these homes along the southwestern side look like they have similar exposure to risk. They don't, because they don't have exposure to wildland fuels that'll carry the fire. So using this approach to target our work to those areas that have the risk of not only it being burned, but the risk of then transmitting that fire into surrounding homes. And so then we take a look at the left and the right, left being the previous ignition scenario, the right being the ignition scenario if those priority parcels are treated. So defensible space and home hardening primarily carried out around the northeastern side of the community on the south side of Buck Gully, and then along those homes that front Buck Gully and the legacy parts of the community to the northwest. And I would note that this modeling showing a change of about 349 fewer ignitions at the 200-minute mark here. The modeling is not inclusive of the firefighting response. And so I'm confident as a career firefighter that on the scenario on the right, that if ignitions were slowed to that modeled pace, we would never reach that point, stage 5 and stage 6 in Jack Cohn's WUI disaster sequence, where the firefighting response has been overwhelmed by the speed and the extent of the fire. And so in this scenario, while Buck Gully is likely to burn, it is unlikely that more than a few homes would either be damaged or destroyed, because each time fire encroached and as it found vulnerabilities that either had been missed or had been created after the defensible space and home hardening was created, as fire exploited those vulnerabilities and those homes began to burn, firefighters would put it out. They would pounce, if you will, and that we would have more firefighters than fire at the critical points in time, and we would never get to runaway ignition. So we start with the modeling, we come up with the recommendations, and then the recommendations are quantified so that we can understand what the time, the money, the effort, and the degree that we are asking community members to make change. We can understand what the benefits of those outcomes are. And then armed with all of that, armed with an understanding of what we believe should be done and the quantification, this sets up an opportunity for the fire district or the fire department to build out a mitigation program and the associated resource requests, and resources in this case being money, meaning people, meaning will to act. We build out the resource requests so that we can move to mitigate these various mechanisms of heat transfer and the initiation of wildland fire, so that by the time we are done, we can bring down the residual risk into something that is acceptable. And I'd hand it to James to offer some thoughts about the degree to which the modeling and the associated development of a plan and the prioritization can then be used to inform an internal discussion within the city or the fire district about resource allocations and resource requests. What are we actually asking for here to achieve what? And then secondly, how that same conversation can be held with the community so that we can be very clear about what we are asking them to do, what the justification for that ask is, and what the outcome is, so that we can take this out of just sort of an open-ended, we need resources and you need to do stuff, and take it from the abstract and really narrow down to brass tacks. James, you'd like to share some thoughts on that?
Absolutely. When it comes to this, both my fire chief, city manager, community members, everyone's asking a lot. What are you doing? What's the plan? What's Newport going to be to reduce the wildfire risk in our community? And so when you look at it, we can anecdotally look at locations and say, yes, that looks like a wildfire risk, but getting the data and science behind it, it helps us drive our resources and funding and staffing to where we're going to prioritize the fuel mitigation work that needs to be done on behalf of the city, where we're going to focus our public education on the homeowners. We know what parcels to prioritize. So with the new fire hazard severity zone maps, we nearly doubled the amount of homeowners that we have in the very high fire hazard severity zone, where per government code, defensible space is required up to 100 feet from the structure, up to the property line. Now we know where to focus that education. So we took this information, now we have a prioritization of rank and file. Where are we going to do treatment on vegetation? Where are we going to provide public education? And where are we going to incentivize for both defensible space and home hardening? And it allows you, it's almost a force multiplier, because rather than expanding your staff to do a lot of stuff that may or may not matter, you're able to focus on priorities that do matter. And we see through science and the data-driven modeling that we can actually get a tangible result for our community. And as we're spending those taxpayer dollars, we're spending it on projects that matter, that will result in that in what we believe should reduce the wildfire risk. The other part of that is that when we talk about education, it's getting the community will to act. A lot of this is on public property, but a lot of this is on private property. And to move that needle beyond a small reduction, we need to get the community to buy in and do those home hardening. So now the structures you see that are the ignition points in the wicks to the community, we can now focus on having those conversations with those homeowners, coming up with creative ways to incentivize doing the work, coming up with ways to show them, hey, this is how you harden, this is vents, and lower that risk, working with HOAs To date, we've done probably about 56 HOA meetings, and we meet with the architectural committees. We meet with the HOA property management groups. We meet with the realtors, the insurance groups, the homeowners to have these discussions. And we're starting to finally see the needle move a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, to where homeowners are starting to take these actions. And in combination of both the landfire element and the 3D modeling Embercast element, we're starting to see that risk kind of, we're able to eliminate it, not completely eliminate it, but really reduce it enough to where hopefully, like Dave said, we can get that fire response before we get the wildfire running on the structures. But it gave us a rank and file prioritization to spend taxpayer dollars in a responsible way. Ultimately, we know what way we're marching in.
Yeah, I mentioned it previously, I'll just mention it again. If you're in a rural setting where homes are at least 50, preferably 100 feet separated, then everyone should do everything everywhere. And that's been state law since 1967 for the defensible space, and since 2008 for the building codes application of Chapter 7A. But if you're in a dense urban setting and that transition, so either an interface versus an intermix, so interface being a hard line between vegetation and the built environment, then you're simply not blindly applying everyone should do defensible space is not going to get you there, because the defensible, one, people are going to be resistive to it. And two, the defensible space, if the home is within 50 feet of the next home, the defensible space is only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is how do you get the home next to them to keep from burning? And it would be better if everything did everything everywhere. That simply hasn't been the reality that we've experienced from a regulatory and a compliance standpoint over the last really now 15 years. And so having that ability to prioritize the work and focusing on the measures of effectiveness and the outcomes, I think is a critical component. I would also say, in my experience, and maybe other communities are different, but in my experience, when dealing with community members around the wildfire risk reduction discussion, there was a fascination on the part of community members with what everyone else was going to do. Right? So if the utility did this, if Caltrans did this, if the water district did this, if the park district did this, if whomever external person did something, wouldn't this problem just go away? What if we just undergrounded the utilities? Wouldn't that solve the problem? Well, the first power line was strung in Pomona in 1891, and California had wildfires long before 1891. That just would remove a single point of ignition. And if all of the open space was mitigated, well, you'd still have examples like Altadena and the Palisades where the ignition was right next to the community. And so distant fuel mods and treatments wouldn't have mattered because the ignition was within 800 meters of the community. And so you very quickly begin to peel off these other opportunities as a single silver bullet that would solve the problem. And we keep coming back to the core issue of the vulnerabilities at those homes that are capable of transitioning a vegetative fire into the built environment. And from my perspective, it is tremendously helpful to be able to quantify what we are asking folks to do on the outreach education side, and then in an associated manner, complementary, to be able to quantify the value of incentives as well. We're talking in some cases about allocating public money to achieve a public good. And if we're going to encourage people to replace wooden fences, if maybe incentivize replacement of windows or roofs or defensible space, it should be in a place where we can clearly demonstrate community benefit so that we don't end up with this shotgun approach where we have a little bit of mitigation or treatment or adaptation here and a little bit here, and we never achieve those network effects. And to be able to achieve network effects, we need to know where to focus our efforts, and we need to be able to track our progress. And the last thing I'll say on this, and then I really look forward to being able to answer some questions, is that from a public policy standpoint, there is, especially in a resource constrained environment, and every community is resource constrained, either with money or will to act, staff resources, etc. In a resource constrained environment the government operates in, before one undertakes a program of mitigation, I think it is critical and necessary to understand not only the efficacy of what's going to be effective and what's our goal, but to understand what the ceiling and the floor is, and the floor being in the number needed to treat, i.e. the minimum below which treatments will be ineffective, and the ceiling in the form of marginal diminishing returns, the point at which additional investment in this particular domain, distant landscape treatments, defensible space, home hardening, firefighting response as the four mitigation domains, beyond which additional investment in that domain will not be effective because we need work in complementary domains. And that if we have neither the will nor the resources to carry out work to achieve network effects to at least the NNT threshold, to at least the floor, then we're probably better off not undertaking a mitigation regime until such time as we have the will, the resources, the ability to do something meaningful. And I think the danger here with carrying out measures that are going to fall below the threshold of effectiveness, there's a moral hazard as you squander the community's will to act on things that are not going to be effective. And it is going to be awfully hard in future years when you come back to say, hey, our bad, we know more, or we have more political will now. We're now going to require you to do additional work, or that the work we have done was ineffective. And that when we report activity, we cut a fuel break, we had a chipping program, we held some meetings, we published a report, the activity we formed from Firewise neighborhoods, activity-based things. We also then diminish the community's will to carry out meaningful actions. So from my perspective, having a plan that identifies not only the manner in which fire is going to come in, but prioritizes the mitigations is a critical precondition to undertaking activities, because activities carried out without a plan are you either get lucky or you're wrong with regard to where those activities, the effect of those activities. And there's a very real challenge then mobilizing the community to be willing to undertake the actual meaningful mitigations when that time comes. We'll hold there, and I'd love to get to some Q&A and be able to answer some questions, Melissa.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just a reminder for the folks on the line, we do have some questions already in, but if you have a question that you haven't submitted yet, please feel free to drop that into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get through as many as we can, but we've got a good chunk of time here. So I want to start with something that's probably top of mind for a lot of folks on the line. James, you talked a lot about engaging with the community and the education component and making sure you're understanding community concerns, etc. What are you hearing in regard to insurability from your community?
Yeah, so the insurance crisis or issue, it's not a scale of economics. We have very wealthy communities here and we have less wealthy communities here, but both are experiencing the same insurance issues. Many completely being dropped by carriers, having to rely on the California Fair Plan. So what we've done is we've worked with homeowners to really prioritize when they have those issues to really go to the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home Standard. And we've had homeowners that have met those standards, which means it's some retroactive work on your home. Creating a zone 0, which is the first 5 feet from the structure, being free from combustibles, having a non-combustible fence as your return fence, your windows, your vents, your roof type, your exterior siding, kind of moving that stuff back as far as combustibles go, and then working on the actual structure and the building envelope itself. And those homeowners were able to not only get insurance, but get insurance with a discount in the admitted market. But we see it at scale, and it's not the maps that we see when we looked at when I showed my first slide and we had our fire hazard severity zone maps, they're not being dropped just because they're in the very high. They're being dropped well outside of the maps altogether, because the insurance groups, they use their own modeling and their own maps. And I find that they're probably a little bit more restrictive than CAL FIRE's in the sense of where they're going and how far they extend out. So we're seeing homeowners that may not be in the CAL FIRE maps being dropped from insurance because in their maps they are a risk. So we do focus a lot of public education there, but the insurance companies are recognizing the IBHS standard. They're buying there. They're at the table. IBHS is really a scientific wing of the insurance world, and so they are buying into it. The problem with, like what Dave said, if one home's doing it but the neighbor is not, especially in a dense environment, it's very limited. So it matters in the sense of the homeowner gets insurance, but until it's scalable, and then we're seeing it in a large amount of homes doing it, the wildfire risk reduction activity is somewhat limited. I mean, it's there, but it's not complete because it's only one home doing it. And we're about 10 homes in out of 4,300 structures. So it's a big undertaking.
Yeah, definitely. And sounds like a lot of education and outreach that needs to be done. And I'm wondering if you could speak. I know you started to share some of this, but if you can speak a little more to how you're approaching that. Are you working with a lot of partners? Are you, is it just standard communication campaigns that you're working with the city on? How are you working to spread the word to ensure that your community understands their responsibility piece of it as well as just the risk in general?
So it's multifaceted. So it's the online approach with social media. It's mailers going direct to homeowners. We have a lot of community members that aren't maybe on social media just due to age, demographic, whatever. And so they're getting mailers. It's going out with their water bills, with their electric bill, with their that sort of stuff. They're getting information on this, and we actually provide a full program here that they can just scan a QR code and make an appointment, and an inspector will go out to their home and walk the property with them and explain everything. So it's the in-person, it's the general large meetings. We work with our Chamber of Commerce a lot. They have Speak Up Newport and Wake Up Newport, which are two big events that we have a lot of community members that maybe have a little bit more public sway to attend and get that information out. We host those. We're a part of that frequently. We partnered with a group. We have a group in Orange County called Coast, and it's all the different fire agencies, the land managers, the Forest Service, and other interested parties that we meet monthly to discuss where our rank and file priority risks are in the county and how we educate our communities. So we're all sending the same message and everyone's shooting their arrows in the same direction. But it is a multifaceted approach. There's no one size fits all. And the other part of that is that some folks just don't respond well to the fire department necessarily telling them what to do. So it's also working with our fire safe councils and educating those community members and having them kind of be neighbor to neighbor ambassadors, if you will, to have those conversations. And I do see traction when one neighbor's doing it and they found a contractor that did good work on their home. The next neighbors tend to use those contractors, and our fire safe council will post the information, these businesses on their website and share it. And we see more scale with that as that have that interaction. We have a large CERT group here. So our community emergency response program, we have a large CERT group. So we use our CERT members to do a lot of that. They can go door to door, they can talk at events, but so just hearing it from someone in a uniform and a badge isn't always necessarily the best medium or delivery of information. So having a person that they know that's been their neighbor for 20 years having that conversation, it does have a tendency to go a long way. So we're empowering community ambassadors, we're empowering our firefighters, our inspectors, and then any other groups in the area. But we meet with a lot of different folks to try to get this needle moved, but it is a multifaceted approach, and it's like a t-shirt, not one size fits all. So we have to approach it very differently.
And Melissa, I would add to that, in addition to the many different ways to reach people, and all of the above is appropriate here, I also think it's helpful to categorize the community members. And I would categorize them into three distinct groups. You have the fully involved, highly engaged early adopters who just want to know what to do and how to do it. And that be either they're going to DIY or they're going to hire somebody. But like, look, they're fire marshal. You had me at good morning, I believe, for whatever reason. Just tell me what I need to do. And for those folks, let's get them the resources, let's get them the information. Let's not make them have to do discovery learning, right? Let's ease that path to adoption. But let's understand that that's also in every community a relatively small subset. And then we have the fat middle, right? The center of the bell curve, which are folks that are just living their life and they don't know, and they're not paying attention. They'd probably be very hard pressed to name a single council member, much less the nuances of the fire code. And there we just need to make sure they become aware that there's this thing and just enough to get them the information they need, and then the resources that we've developed through the early adopters to get them on their way. And then the last third are the folks that are going to truly dig in and be opposed. And they're, I mean, look, meet them, exchange information, hear what they have to say. All perspectives are interesting, but there are some immutable physical laws of heat transfer here that I feel statements and people's self-research simply cannot hand wave out of the conversation. And there are, well, if you followed any of the public debate around wildfire the last couple of years, there's some really fantastical stuff has been introduced that simply isn't borne out by either science, experimentation, research, or the collective experience of the firefighting community. And for those folks, look, I mean, hear what they have to say and listen to them. but focus the effort on those early adopters to refine what you're doing, and then transferring the lessons learned and harnessing the energy and the momentum formed by the early adopters to address that big fat middle. And by the time we get down to, to the folks that are truly opposed, well, if the rest of the community has done the work, then we have mechanisms for enforcement at that point. But we've addressed all of those who are willing to do the work through education and outreach. We've addressed all of those folks first before we get to those sticky, really hard folks at the end. But at the same time, let's be crystal clear. I mean, if you want to see me have my face turn red and my blood pressure go up, say that our approach is education and meeting people where they are. And I would point out that we are, 20 some odd years into Fire Safe. California Fire Safe Council and others who do great work have been around for decades. And we have not substantively moved the needle with regard to adoption of meaningful mitigations. And that because of immutable laws of heat transfer, partial mitigations are ineffective. The risk mitigation curve is not linear. If you do a little bit of work, you don't get a little bit of benefit. It's a log normal where you get no benefit whatsoever until you get to about the 85% rate at both the single parcel and in an aggregation of parcels. And then there's this reverse waterfall of increase in benefit. And so without some really concerted outreach, education, incentives, and enforcement in the targeted areas, information sharing and meeting people where they are has just not proven effective anywhere. Now that's while interesting things like HOAs can be early adopters who have the ability through CC&Rs to be more restrictive. Right? There's other levers to pull here, but I think it's really important to understand that just information sharing alone, which is a critical component, but it's also has not proved effective. Maybe it will somewhere. I'd love to talk about an exception, but at least, in the current landscape, that approach alone is just not going to get us there.
Melissa, I'll add to that. The slide that Dave showed, where it showed the return on investment, essentially, of without the mitigations and with the mitigations, where you saw that fire spread in the urban environment. Just having that slide alone and bringing that up in a presentation or showing that speaks volumes beyond just us talking about transfer fire, the spread of fire, how it works. Seeing that and seeing their own communities and how that fire spreads in there is a narrative on its own that I feel like that emotionally did change some trajectory for us as far as buy-in goes. Just seeing the actual effects of it. Palisades happened, Eden happened, and it was, we could be next. That is going away, and that earnest wanting to participate in the risk reduction process, it's kind of died down quite a bit, and now probably won't happen here. So showing this genuinely did have an emotional change and effect that told a narrative that really got a lot of buy-in for our community.
Yeah, no, I love all of the comments that you're making. And as I mentioned at the forefront, community engagement is one of our pillars of work, and we do a lot of training and content development around this. And I just want to hit on a couple of things that you both have shared in terms of how this can potentially be more fruitful. And I think what we're looking at right now, and James, to your point about visualizing this in your own community is a great one. I think we in local government world often we talk a lot in insider baseball terms. We talk a lot in acronyms. We talk a lot in, these really complex issues that you work with on a day-to-day basis, but your community isn't going to be as familiar with. And so grounding it in something that they can visually see the potential impact to their communities, I think is a great tool to be thinking about this and trying to move the needle. And I just also love the fact that you were talking about different ways of engagement, different targets of types of outreach for different target types of folks in your community. We talk a lot about a community landscaping exercise where you're really grounding yourself in who's in your community, how do they want to receive information, and targeting your outreach methods to that. And I particularly liked the ambassador model and the community organization, HOA, PTA, whatever those organizations are that you want to work through can be a great mechanism if they aren't going to respond to, in your example, somebody in a uniform necessarily. So just wanted to put a couple of points on that, but love love the comments about around how you're doing that and what's working, because I think it in some cases an uphill battle to get that education done. So seeing a few more questions come in here, and a couple of, I think, clarifying questions or folks looking for tools to help them do some of this modeling. So Dave, we had a question come in around how can a community obtain the modeling that you demonstrated to identify some of those priority target mitigation types and areas?
So with the caveat that I've been doing this for a long time, topography, weather, and fuel, and optimize your output for speed-based pathways. And it, obviously, if that's not something that's within the expertise and you don't have access to a fire behavior analyst, that's certainly something at Renne Public Management Group we do, as well as there are other resources for it as well. So I want to be crystal clear. There's nothing. This isn't a proprietary view of risk, and it's accessible if you have those resources. If you don't, though, and I really want to just pound the table on this, you wouldn't go lay out a new road system without having a traffic engineer. You wouldn't put in, a new whatever without having studied it. Have a plan. And that, like I said, that's certainly something we can do. The weather is available through the RAW stations everywhere in North America. Topography is known through the National NADS 82 or WGS 84. So we know topography. And then fuel is available through Landfire. So all of the data is available, and then compile it and then optimize the outputs specific to community exposure. So like I said, that's something we do. There's other ways to get it as well, but just have a plan.
Yeah, do your homework, have a plan. And Dave, if you're willing to share some of those resources with us, we're happy to send that out in the follow-up email. Obviously, you yourself are a great resource in that space, but if folks are looking for options here, would love to be able to share some of that, as well as the agencies and links you just mentioned in terms of where to access all of those different types of data that would need to be culminated into that modeling. And then another question related to the modeling that you're using here. How are you modeling the structure to structure fire spread? And that this seems like a very technical question, but
yeah, it is. So so the first thing you're making is an assumption about whether or not the home is mitigated or not. And this is a binary, it's a yes, no. There's no partial mitigation, because then you'd have to have research that doesn't exist about what is and it's gonna be a while till we have causal factors for individual condition codes that cause a home to burn or not burn. So assumption is home is either fully mitigated or it's not mitigated to the wildfire prepared base standard or the CDI Safer from Wildfire Framework base standard. And so then you look at really the mechanisms of ignition from vegetation, or either ground component fire, which in the case of a couple of these, interrupted by FMZs or not, or defensible space, and three-dimensional ember cast. If you have vulnerabilities present and you are within the ember distribution from ember producing fuels, you start to see ignitions. And then if those homes are within 25 or 50 feet of adjacent homes, you start to see adjacent homes ignited by direct heat transfer. And you see homes ignited by three-dimensional ember cast produced by structures. So what you're really doing is you're looking at node edge connections, the node being the structures, edges being vegetation, or fences or other things that would carry fire to other structures. So you have node edge node, or you have node to node, and then you have node to edge to node via embers. And you run a series of mathematical models combined with the semi-empirical mathematical models used for vegetation spread, and then structure to structure models that account for what happens once the fire gets into the community. I would argue that if you were sort of the simple way to do this would be to just run the vegetation models and understand the entry points. That gets you most of the way there. It's also, though, very helpful to understand the consequences of those entry points. And for that, you need to run urban fire spread.
perfect. Thank you.
Technical question, technical answer.
Yes,
Sorry, I wish there was a way
technical
to
question,
dumb it down.
technical answer. But if they're asking the question, I'm sure they're looking for the details you just provided. So thank you for taking that. Want to talk a little bit about some of the mitigation strategies. We have a question that came in about the role of native plants in reducing fire risk. Can either of you speak to how that can be a helpful mitigation strategy, or is it a helpful mitigation strategy?
Yeah, let me jump on this one first, then I'll let James talk about southern coastal scrub. He's got a lot more experience in that than I do. So native plants are beneficial for a lot of reasons. Pollinators, ecosystems, etc. Not my area of expertise, but I think it's important to acknowledge. The second thing that's important to acknowledge, though, is most, not all, but most native plants have a fire adaptation in a fire-dependent landscape. Some of those plants' adaptation is they grow back really fast after wildfire to take advantage of the blank slate, if you will, that the stand replacement high-intensity fire creates. And so just because it is native doesn't mean that it necessarily reduces fire risk, because if its adaptation is it grows back really fast, that may mean it contributes to fire spread. And if we're worried about the ability of fire to move over a landscape, some of those adaptations aren't necessarily beneficial. As a general statement, ground fuels will burn and will carry fire, especially once they're dried out, they've gone dormant, and they're in their desiccated state. That builds over time as the decadent component increases, as in the amount of dead material. Because if you are in, we covered this last month, but if you're in Mediterranean County grassland, the historic fire return interval is generally 3 to 5 years. If you're in brush fields, exclusive of southern coastal scrub, which is a different ecosystem, it's more like 15 years, give or take. And then if you're in timber, 15 to 25 is the annual fire return interval. Southern coastal scrub, it's like 49 to 130 year fire return interval. But my point is that once we have excluded fire from the landscape, we've taken out nature's and the environment's primary regulator, its regulative system that keeps everything in stasis. And so we have accumulations of fuel, of vegetative fuel. So native landscaping can have a lot of benefits with regard to ecosystems. It is not automatically beneficial with regard to fire spread. And the question then becomes the age class and how it's maintained, the configuration. So we're looking at vertical and horizontal separation and the distribution of the plant species and what's in between them. And then lastly, we're looking at the chemical component. So does it have volatile oils? And specific to southern coastal scrub, many of those plants not only have a lot of decadent material, but they also have volatile oils that cause them to burn. But James, anything you'd like to add specific to southern coastal scrub? Because that's certainly been a topic of a lot of litigation recently.
No, I think you kind of nailed it. And for us, it is more of like a 40-year burn period. But if you look at the research on it, just with the human interactions, not inclusive of natural wildfires such as lightning strikes, it looks like it went from 20 to 40 years or 40 to 100 years is more an average of 20 years now for as far as their burning goes.
We just got a follow-up question that I think is related to this conversation. Can you speak to the benefits of hydrated landscape? So Dave, to your point, talking about when it's in its dormant state or all of that. So how can that play into this equation in this conversation? If you're talking about well-hydrated landscaping as well as mature tree canopies. So in terms of not deflecting, but in terms of protection from ember spread.
Yeah, so two different things. And some research has been done on this primarily in China on the use of green belts to protect plantations, so tree plantations, keep fire out. So I'll be very clear, we're talking two different domains here. On the landscape domain, an extended defensible space, so things greater than 30 feet from a structure. Use of hydrated landscaping, fuel modification zones that include an irrigation component are maintained as such. Very useful. If the live fuel moisture levels are low and the plant is either selected, ice plant as an example, for one that has very low potential for creating decadent material, then hydrated green belts are an effective barrier to ground component. That methodology, though, which is appropriate for a green belt, distant from home, simply doesn't work in the home ignition zone, really within 30 feet of a house. And there's two practical components here. One is the maintenance and the future maintenance of that plant. So if on day X, it is well maintained, i.e. all the dead material has been cut out and it's well hydrated, and it is not exposed to other things that will burn that are near it, then that plant is likely to not contribute to fire spread. If any of those factors change, though, it grows And in growing, it produces decadent material inside the plant itself. So decadent material in a vertical configuration, or it grows and things are deposited. So you create a receptive fuel bed underneath it from its own deposition, and or other things that will burn are placed around it. Then we start to fundamentally change the outcome, and everything will burn at a certain temperature. There's no such thing as really any material. I mean, steel at the right heat, temperature, and with supplemental oxygen, steel will burn, right? At 1200 degrees Fahrenheit with O2. So everything will burn, and vegetation is no exception. And so really there's a maintenance component. How's it going to be maintained in out years? And then critically for a local agency, there's an enforcement component. If how do we tell that this plant meets the live fuel moisture levels and will continue to meet those in, say, January during a wind event in the LA Basin, and is going to be maintained so that it does not grow decadent material over time and doesn't produce litter on the ground. And lastly, specific to zone 0, that plant, irregardless of its combustibility, doesn't act as a net that's catching blown combustible material from other plants. So if you have a tree 100 feet from the house, it's not going to threaten the house. But that tree is dropping needles, litter, leaves, etc. Those are being blown. They're being captured by the plant that has fire smart characteristics next to the home and is also catching embers. And now we've produced a receptive fuel bed and ignition source. So that's for brush and ground planting. For trees, it's all about the maintenance. So a intact tree canopy is rarely, if ever, the source of ignition if that tree is maintained in accordance with state law. So it's not overhanging a stovepipe or chimney by 10 feet. It does not have ladder fuels that will allow fire to climb, and it doesn't have dead or dying material in the canopy. And Jack Cohn recently presented a series of slides that showed Paradise, Lahaina, other examples where the homes are all burned and the trees are intact. The trees are generally not the problem as long as they're maintained in a way that they don't have ladder fuels and they don't have dead material. That's not necessarily true of the roof that is adjacent to a tree where all the leaves and pine needles will accumulate.
Debris.
Right? That's a different animal. But the tree itself is rarely a contributor to fire spread if it's properly maintained. And that's particularly true in the Mediterranean counties where there just aren't the conditions that would allow a crown fire, a running crown fire, where the crowns are burning independent of the ground fire. That's more of a homogeneous conifer forest Great Basin phenomenon and not something you would see in a Mediterranean county.
Right. I think we might have time for one more question, and I think this is also something that's always top of mind for folks when we have these conversations is funding. So is there any funding opportunities that either of you can share? And this question is framed very broadly in terms of fire mitigation, but maybe speaking more to some of the things we talked about today. Is there funding for some of this modeling or planning? Is there funding available for some of these incentives, James, that you talked about? Is there funding available for folks to start to implement some of these things in their communities that you would recommend or be able to share?
Yeah, go ahead, James.
And say, for us, I know our grant was specifically through CAL FIRE, so we use CAL FIRE for that. There's a lot of grant fund or the California Fire Safe Councils. They that's another opportunity. There are grants out there to look for, federal grants that are available depending on what the project is. For modeling specifically, we didn't do that. That was something that we went to council and asked for funding for. And so the city paid for that. But I will say that the grants, a lot of times, primarily, it seems that they have to do a lot with vegetation management and education. I haven't seen a lot in the sense of just necessarily modeling, but I'm sure if it's something that has to do with your local hazard mitigation plan or CWPP, they do have grants for those, and that modeling could be a part of that to drive the narrative of that CWPP or that local hazard mitigation plan. And I'd look at that as a component of it and going for grants potentially to affect those.
Yeah, and I would add specifically for outreach and education, the California Fire Foundation regularly makes a relatively small dollar, but they regularly make grants for outreach and education activities, websites, etc. And to James's point, if you are going to be updating your local hazard mitigation plan, your safety element, or your community wildfire protection plan, your CWPP, tremendous opportunity to improve some modeling instead of sort of just statements of, you know, we should wildfire's a risk and we should do stuff to reduce risk. Usually you'd want to do that as an annex so that it can be updated. Annual updates, if you're doing work, are appropriate. And then the CAL FIRE and the state of California through the climate change, CCI, Climate Change Investment Grant Program. Also the Coastal Conservancy has been very active in the grant space, distributing state funds.
Okay, perfect. We'll pull together some of those links and share that with folks as well, but appreciate the thoughts on that. And I know it's a moving target in some cases with the CCI funding and all of that, and dependent on state budgets and all of those fun things. But we'll definitely share the resources that you both just mentioned in terms of possible grant opportunities to take bites of this, right? Whether that's the outreach and education component or the planning, or to your point about updating portions of your general plan elements, things like that. So we'll make sure to get those out to you all as well. So doing a quick time check, we are almost at time. So I've got a couple of closing slides to share with you all, and then we will let you get back to the rest of your afternoon. So let me get this back up for us. Okay. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of a series of webinars that we're doing on wildfire risk. So we definitely welcome you to join us for the last two of the series. That next one will be in mid-November. And again, the last one will be in January of 2026. But registration is open for both of those now. So feel free to drop a registration and you'll get them on your calendar, and we'll send more information when we get closer. But definitely take a look at those, as well as the recording and materials from our first session that we mentioned at the beginning. Quick reminder about our network. If you're interested in this topic or these webinars or other things that we at ILG are working on, please connect with us on our social media channels and our newsletter. Join our network so you can stay informed of additional opportunities such as this webinar. Final reminder that we did record the presentation, and we'll be sharing that along with the materials electronically within a few days. So keep an eye out for an email from us with that information. And then lastly, just wanted to share contact information for this group. I know we weren't able to get to every single question that came in, so wanted to put this up in case you want to have any follow-up with myself or with James or Dave. But just really want to say thank you, both Dave, James, so much for this conversation and your expertise and the in-depth and technical way you were able to answer all of the questions that came in. So just really appreciate your time this afternoon, sharing all of this information. I want to thank our audience also for spending the last 90 minutes with us to talk about this really important issue. So Dave, James, any final thoughts before we close out for this afternoon?
Thank James for sharing with us. I know it is not an easy thing to open the door to the internal deliberations of how you got there. And then for everyone who's looking at this space, have a plan. We spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money, in my words, kind of wandering around in the wilderness doing stuff. And we have the ability to understand the requirements of a thoughtful, nuanced, and balanced community mitigation plan. And without having done the plan, the odds of getting it right through blind luck and through prescriptive application of different approaches are very, very low.
Melissa, I was going to jump in and say two things. One, the screen you have up right now, it's not showing the contact info. It's a Word document, just so you know, so that way you can get that up. So I think you went to the last part without it. Just so you can put it up if anyone wants to reach out or they have any questions. And then two, the biggest thing I'm saying,
did I fix it?
No, it's still the same thing.
It's still
Just
okay.
a heads up. But let's say one of the conversations that Dave and I have had together is that this is a hard problem. This is not an easy problem. It's a hard problem. And it's not, while fire is in the title, it is not just a fire department problem. It is a community problem. And so it's a broad discussion, as many stakeholders and as many relationships as you can build those relationships, have those stakeholders, but it's not an easy problem. It is a hard problem. But come up with a plan, like Dave said, to try to address it as best you can. And then where you have your shortcomings, learn from that and adjust course, and don't be afraid to change the plan if need be.
Perfect. Okay, let me see if I can do this one more time and see if I can get the right screen share going. Okay. Did it work that time?
Victory.
Perfect. Okay. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Hopefully you're now seeing the contact information if you want to follow up with this team after today's session. But thank you again. Really appreciate your time. And everybody have a great afternoon.